What if I told you that the smartest person in the room, like the brilliant engineer or, the Ivy League surgeon, is mathematically more likely to make a catastrophic financial mistake than, say, a janitor who just simply knows their own emotional limits? Today, we are arguing the core premise behind the psychology of wealth.
Right.
Specifically, we're looking at the widely studied frameworks that separate just getting rich from actually staying wealthy. And the central proposition we're wrestling with today is fascinating. It's this idea that financial success is not primarily a function of intelligence, right? It's not about complex financial modeling. It's a function of pure behavior.
And that premise, that's exactly where our perspectives on this material really diverge, because it raises a massive, vital question about causality.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to ask ourselves, is individual behavioral discipline actually the primary driver of wealth? Or is financial success fundamentally dictated by, the external forces of luck, unquantifiable risk, and just the vastly different systemic starting lines people are born into?
Well, I take the position that this framework is entirely correct in its focus on individual agency. True wealth is an internal achievement. I mean, it is fundamentally driven by manageable daily behavioral choices. We're talking about the active regulation of ego, the mastery of patience, and just emotional control over one's capital. It is the conscious, repeated habits we form that dictate our financial reality over the long term, far more than our background.
Right, and I come at it from a completely different angle. I argue that the impact of individual behavior is heavily overstated in these kinds of psychological frameworks.
Okay.
When you dig into the actual mechanics of how money moves and grows, you see that financial outcomes are heavily constrained by systemic luck and, quite frankly, unpredictable tail events. Like, yes, behavior matters, of course, but focusing solely on the individual ignores the massive invisible scaffolding of privilege, timing, and variance that actually dictates who survives long enough to get wealthy.
I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective based directly on the mechanics of money. The concept here is undeniably clear, You do not need a high IQ to build wealth because wealth building isn't a hard science.
Sure.
It's a soft skill. One of the most critical distinctions we have to look at is the mechanical difference between getting wealthy and staying wealthy.
Right, getting rich versus staying rich.
Exactly. Getting wealthy requires taking a risk, right? Being optimistic, maybe starting a business. But staying wealthy requires the exact opposite psychological profile. It requires paranoia.
Well, paranoia?
Yeah. It requires you to accept that your past success was at least partly lucky, which means you need humility and caution to hold on to it.
Well, but caution and humility are highly subjective terms when we look at the environment shaping a person's baseline reality, don't you think?
They are. But let me finish the thought, because the framework introduces a concept that I believe is universally applicable, and that is, wealth is what you don't see. True wealth isn't the Ferrari driving down the street. It's the invisible savings, the index funds, the money actively not spent. And here's why behavior is the paramount mechanism. Spending less than you earn is an active daily choice.
Yeah.
Even with a high income, if your ego demands you spend everything to prove you make a lot of money, you remain fundamentally broke. Because wealth building relies on the behavioral choice to widen the gap between your ego and your income, it remains firmly within an individual's behavioral control.
I mean, that's a compelling argument. And I agree that spending less than you earn is a mathematical necessity. But behavior is not generated in a vacuum. Sure, let's look at the principle from the material that no one is crazy. People make financial decisions based on their localized, deeply personal experiences of how the world works.
Right.
If someone grew up in an environment characterized by extreme scarcity where, inflation or systemic instability meant that money saved today was effectively worthless tomorrow, spending immediately isn't a failure of ego. It is a completely rational survival mechanism.
Well, rational to them in the moment, but the math of compounding doesn't care about their localized experience.
But you can't separate the math from the psychology of the person executing it.
Well,
Someone who grew up in absolute comfort naturally trusts the system. They inherently believe that deferred gratification will be rewarded. That trust is a luxury. So when we judge financial success as a pure triumph of individual behavior, we are completely ignoring the fact that the psychological ability to even plan for the future is a byproduct of environmental stability.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently, because I think you're letting people off the hook for the conscious choices they make today. Let's look at how a bad financial decision is actually formed in the brain. The primary driver of financial ruin isn't usually starvation.
Okay.
It's the inability to define enough. It's the man in the car paradox.
You mean the signaling aspect of wealth?
Exactly. What is the paradox? People buy a luxury car because they want to signal to others that they are successful. They want admiration. But the irony is, the observer on the street doesn't admire the driver. The observer just projects themselves into the driver's seat and wishes they had the car.
Right, it's just a mirror.
Exactly. The bad financial decision to finance a depreciating asset stems directly from the psychological trap of trying to impress strangers. If you're listening to this, you might be thinking, I have discipline, I just want nice things. But that desire for endless more is what pushes people out on the risk curve until they collapse.
I don't disagree that signaling is dangerous. It totally is.
Right. So overcoming that evolutionary desire to signal status is a purely internal choice. Think of your savings rate not as a pile of money, but as the shock absorbers on a car.
Okay, I like that.
The road is the global economy. It is full of unavoidable potholes, recessions, sudden job losses. That is the risk. If you spend exactly what you earn to maximize your status, your car has no shock absorbers. Even a 2-inch pothole will snap the axle.
Yeah.
But your savings rate, your behavioral willingness to suppress your ego and live below your means, is the suspension system that allows the vehicle to keep moving forward despite the terrain. If your axle snaps because you refuse to install shock absorbers, we don't blame the pothole, we blame you.
I mean, the shock absorber analogy is vivid and mechanically accurate, but I actually think it highlights my perspective beautifully.
Really? How so?
You are assuming every driver starts with the same functional vehicle and the same capacity to install those upgrades. Going back to the idea that no one is crazy, what looks like a terrible decision to you makes perfect sense to someone else.
How does driving without shock absorbers make sense?
Because some people are born into cars that are already falling apart, driving on unpaved roads filled with craters, while others are cruising on freshly paved highways. Let's talk about the psychological toll of poverty. If you have been structurally denied access to meaningful wealth building, if your income barely covers rent, buying a flashy watch or a lottery ticket isn't a failure to define enough.
Well, it is a rational purchase of temporary status or hope in a system where the traditional, slow path to wealth feels mathematically impossible. Defining enough is a philosophical exercise for the upper middle class. It is incredibly easy to say I don't need a Ferrari when you already own a reliable Honda and a house.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it drifts into pure determinism. It suggests that if you start at a disadvantage, your behavior doesn't matter, which is categorically false.
It's not that it doesn't matter, it's that it's constrained.
But let's follow your logic and move from the psychological triggers of spending into the actual mathematical mechanisms of how wealth grows. If our behavioral baseline is set, how does the math take over? This entire framework hinges on compounding.
Yes, the exponential growth of capital over time.
Exactly. And the ultimate proof of compounding is Warren Buffett. But the crucial counterintuitive insight here isn't just that he is a great investor. It's that something like 99% of his net worth was accumulated after his 50th birthday.
Right.
Why? Because the base of his capital got so large that small percentage gains represented billions of dollars. But let's look at the behavioral cost of that math.
The cost being time, obviously.
Time, yes, but more specifically, cognitive dissonance. To achieve those compounding returns, Buffett had to sit through multiple market crashes where his portfolio lost 40 or 50% of its value.
Yeah, massive drawdowns.
Natural human panic response is to sell and stop the bleeding. The behavior that built his wealth wasn't just waiting. It was the active, agonizing emotional regulation required to literally do nothing while watching billions of dollars vanish on paper. Compounding doesn't care about your childhood or your privilege. It only cares about time and consistency. The behavioral discipline to not interrupt the math is the true engine of wealth.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that patience is the ultimate equalizer here. Let's examine the specific mechanism of those investment returns, specifically the math of tail events.
You mean the idea that a tiny minority of events drive the majority of outcomes?
Exactly. We live in a tail-driven world. The framework explicitly outlines that in any given portfolio or business venture, a huge percentage of decisions will fail. If you make 10 investments, maybe 8 go to zero, 1 breaks even, and 1 yields a 10,000% return.
Right.
The math of that one tail event is incredibly asymmetric. It completely eclipses the total losses of the 8 failures. That is what actually drives the compounding you're talking about.
Which perfectly validates the need for patient behavior. You have to wait for that one massive win to emerge.
But waiting isn't a passive cost-free activity. The price of those high returns is extreme volatility. My pushback is this: surviving 8 sequential failures requires pre-existing capital. It requires a systemic safety net. If you are an average investor with limited capital and your first 3 decisions happen to fall into the inevitable failure category, you are wiped out.
But
Your portfolio is gone. You don't get to stick around for year 7 to catch the one massive tailwind that makes you rich.
okay, that's a sequencing issue, but it doesn't invalidate the behavior itself.
It proves that the behavior is secondary to the starting conditions. Patience cannot magically sustain a person through severe market crashes if they don't have the liquidity to pay their mortgage during that crash. Being able to absorb a 50% drawdown without selling isn't just emotional regulation. It is a byproduct of having enough surplus cash that you aren't forced to liquidate your investments to buy groceries. Patience is remarkably easy when you have the capital to survive failure. It is impossible when one failure means total ruin. That is structural luck masquerading as individual genius.
I think you are misinterpreting the application of the framework. That is exactly why the principle of room for error is so deeply emphasized. If you accept your own premise that volatility is brutal, that life is unpredictable, and that 8 out of 10 bets might fail, then the behavioral habit of maintaining a margin of safety is your absolute only defense.
But again, building that room for error requires a surplus income to begin with.
Let me challenge you on this directly, because I think this is the crux of the debate. If we agree that luck and risk play a massive, unavoidable role in our financial lives, doesn't that make the behavioral habit of building a room for error even more essential rather than less?
Well,
You cannot control the sequence of market returns. You cannot control inflation. The margin of safety, saving cash that yields nothing, just to protect you from the unknown, is the one lever of control we actually have against a chaotic universe. It's the difference between risk, which we can calculate, and pure uncertainty, which we can't.
I concede that building a margin of safety is logically essential. I mean, mechanically, it is the correct move.
Right.
But acknowledging its necessity doesn't change the reality that for millions of people, a room for error is violently erased by external forces entirely outside their behavioral control.
But having some margin is inherently better than having none when the disaster hits, isn't it?
Of course it is, but let's look at the ultimate goal of all this wealth building. The framework posits that the highest dividend money pays is freedom, the ability to wake up and say, I can do whatever I want today. It's about controlling your time.
Exactly.
But my point is, achieving that theoretical freedom remains heavily gated by systemic risk. You can have perfect discipline. You can flawlessly suppress your ego, ignore the luxury cars, save diligently to build a margin of safety, and still be undone by a massive medical crisis, a localized economic collapse, or a predatory institution. Pure behavioral flexibility cannot always overcome the sheer crushing weight of a negative tail event.
But what is the alternative? If you don't practice the behavior, you are guaranteed to fail.
The alternative is simply humility in how we judge outcomes. It is recognizing that when we see a wealthy person, we are observing a survivor of a highly volatile system, not just a master of self-discipline. And when we see someone struggling financially, we shouldn't immediately assume they lack self-control or suffer from the man in the car complex. The forces of luck and risk are often invisible, but they are just as powerful as the forces of compounding.
I see the weight of what you're saying. And yet, if we step back and summarize where this leaves us regarding the mechanics of money, I must reaffirm my stance on agency. Yes, risk is an undeniable reality that can strike anyone. Yes, some people start closer to the finish line than others. But for the vast majority of people navigating the modern economy, the conscious behavioral choices outlined in these frameworks remained the absolute most reliable engines we possess for achieving independence.
Even if those engines occasionally stall out due to bad weather?
Precisely. You cannot control the weather, but you must still seal the hull of your ship. To actively embrace compounding and hold through the agony of drawdowns, to continuously choose to widen the gap between your ego and your income, to consciously reject the signaling game of visible luxury, and to find your own internal sense of enough. These are profound acts of agency.
Yeah.
True wealth is what you don't see. It is the quiet daily discipline of the individual that builds the invisible foundation strong enough to withstand almost anything the environment throws at it.
And as I summarize my perspective, I reiterate the absolute necessity of intellectual humility when trying to decode financial success. Because people's financial realities are forged in vastly different environments, we simply cannot decouple a person's behaviors from the systemic forces that shape them. The mathematical realities of asymmetric tail events and market volatility dictate that survival is often a prerequisite for compounding, and survival requires capital. We must judge less, recognizing that the margin between brilliant, compounding success and devastating failure is incredibly thin, and often determined by factors completely outside our control.
You know, despite our different lenses on causality, there are profound points of convergence we both take from this discussion. We both completely agree on the fundamental counterintuitive insight that financial success relies far less on raw intelligence or analytical horsepower than society assumes.
Oh, absolutely. Being a genius doesn't save you if you can't control your emotions during a 40% market crash.
Right.
I mean, a high IQ might actually make you more susceptible to over-tinkering with your portfolio when you should really just sit on your hands.
And we both fully endorse the profound warning against the endless pursuit of more. The psychological trap of never being satisfied, of constantly moving the goalposts to match your neighbors, is universally destructive. It doesn't matter if you view wealth primarily through the lens of individual agency or environmental luck. If you cannot define enough, you will eventually risk everything you have for things you don't need.
Agreed. We are perfectly aligned in the belief that the ultimate, most mathematically sound value of wealth is time and freedom, rather than visible luxury. Buying back your own Tuesday is infinitely more valuable than buying a luxury watch.
There is immense value in holding both of our perspectives simultaneously, I think. We must recognize our own agency and take rigorous responsibility for the behaviors we can control. Our savings rate, our ego, our patience. But at the same time, we must remain deeply humble about the undeniable role of chance in our outcomes. The mechanics of wealth offer incredibly rich grounds for listeners to reevaluate their own financial architecture.
It leaves us with the challenging task of looking at our own ledgers, our own habits, and trying to untangle exactly how much of our position is due to our brilliant discipline, and how much is simply the grace of a fortunate tailwind.
Which brings us back to that core paradox of what is visible versus what is hidden. We can easily count the dollars someone spends, but we can never truly see the discipline they exercised, the psychological battles they fought, or the quiet strokes of luck that kept them in the game. The most important components of wealth and the forces that truly sustain it will always be the ones we cannot see.